another huge issue, speaking of Trump, obviously the ongoing deportation wave. One of the centers of that has been the Denver area, where, of course, Aurora, Colorado was one of the places during the presidential campaign that was heavily highlighted as by Trump by being taken over by quote unquote criminals and so on and so forth. A lot going on there in terms of people pushing back against this deportation wave. We are very, very happy to be joined here by Katie Leonard, who's an organizer in Denver with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Katie, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, great to have you here. This past Saturday, I know there was a large demonstration in Denver. I know in Denver, Aurora, the broader sort of metro area, a lot's going on. Maybe just give us a capsule view, the 20,000 foot, of what the response of the community has been to the targeting of this area, one of the most targeted areas in terms of ICE's deportation wave.
Yeah, I mean, with Operation Aurora, we've been under attack here in Colorado since even before Trump took office. And we've seen a massive response even before raids began. Huge numbers of people were ready to struggle, ready to protest and organize, and really just reject this racist narrative that immigrants are criminals, right? Here in Aurora, like 1 in 5 people are immigrants. If you're not an immigrant, you know an immigrant, you love an immigrant, you work or go to school with an immigrant, and you can't attack 20% of a population and everyone who loves them and expect people to just like lay down and take it. People here are standing up and like really ready to fight back.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could explain how exactly Aurora, Colorado has become this focal point for both right-wing and anti-immigrant agitation and the community-led resistance to it. And also, I'm curious how the Trump mass deportation policies that are being implemented and all the rhetoric around it has actually emboldened the far right in the area.
Yeah, I think it's really important people know that this struggle here, really this narrative about, criminals taking over Aurora started way back this past summer of 2024 in July. And it was the seeds for Operation Aurora were planted by a right-wing city council person named Danielle Drinsky and this slumlord CBZ management. There was essentially a narrative that took off in the right-wing media that Venezuelan gangs were taking over apartment complexes here. Right-wing politicians like Danielle Drinsky really carried that narrative. The media also played a big role in just the way that took off. And it emboldened people and the right wing to the extent that you had some right-wing vigilantes in these neighborhoods, in these apartment complexes, armed folks that were coming to sort of harass people that live at these apartment complexes, which is really ridiculous. And this is all sort of a result of really a huge influx of Venezuelan people we've had come to Colorado in the past 3 years or so, something like 40,000 Venezuelan folks. And right-wing politicians are running with this narrative, and it has real human impact, of course. And people are fed up with it. It could have been seen as an attack on one group at the time, like Venezuelans specifically, but people have started to see, right? We've seen this before, and it could be any sort of immigrant group that comes under attack in the same way. So really, all of our immigrant communities and everyone, else, their allies are standing up and they're fed up. They're over it, really.
Well, one question I have is I guess, how's it going for ICE? Because I saw Mr. Homan went on Fox News and seemed very upset that, people had been telling people their legal rights. But nonetheless, I wonder if there's been a real, sorry, I almost dropped something there, a real inability for them to fully carry out, what they were sort of threatening, in the lead up here.
Yeah, last week we saw a literal army of federal agents be unleashed on our community from ATF, CPB, DEA, FBI, US Marshals, ICE, you name it. They came into our communities. I think they said something like 400 agents, military vehicles, guns, armor. It was extremely militarized. And they said they were targeting, 100 violent criminals. But what they really did was go door to door at apartment complexes in Denver and Aurora, asking people things like if they speak English, if they're citizens, demanding people show them their papers. And that really, it really was clear to people by then that, okay, these aren't targeted raids, right? They're really here to terrorize folks. And they actually weren't able to pick up. I mean, one person taken by ICE is one too many, right? But they weren't able to just round up people indiscriminately because people do know their rights. And that's a big result of the fact that community has been spreading know your rights information. And that is like a barrier to ICE being able to just scoop people up here in Colorado and across the country. And Tom Homan has been upset, obviously visibly in the news about things happening across the country, but especially here in Colorado. It was a real failure for them. It was a real embarrassment. Media sort of caught from every angle the way that they failed because people know their constitutional rights and community is standing with, their immigrant neighbors.
I want to tie in a couple of things here, and that is, when it comes to the issue, and you already alluded to this, when it comes to the issue of immigration in the U.S., the struggle for justice extends far beyond any one administration or one party, right? Because you were talking about how some of these issues were taking place even before Trump came along. Excuse me. So I guess, can you talk a bit about, you mentioned last summer and the right wing, but also what were you facing when it came to these issues under the Biden administration? And I think it's important to always remember that this is a bipartisan problem because people tend to associate it with the Republicans because their rhetoric is just so much more abhorrent. So that's one. And two, how would you tie this into violent policing? And I say this in terms of specifically Aurora, because Aurora has a history of violent policing. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the murder, for example, of Elijah McClain. And of course, there's the city's collaboration with ICE. So I'm just curious how violent policing ties together with what's going on right now. And I know this is like a two-pronged question. I always do this, so please forgive me. But also just, giving attention to the fact that this is a bipartisan problem.
Yeah. I mean, as we all know too, like it's not just Biden, but you go back to the Obama administration, and Obama was nicknamed the deporter in chief, right? And you hear from a lot of people here in the community, the things they've been going on for a long time under Democrats, under Republicans, right? It is bipartisan. And I mean, what happened this past summer with really what's a slumlord teamed up with politicians, but they faced no real pushback from like the Democratic administration, right? Like this narrative was allowed to just be carried and taken off. Like we didn't have, any sort of protections from politicians. Like Democratic, liberal, quote unquote, progressive politicians locally weren't, standing up and leading the fight back. Like it's been people that have been leading the fight back to all of this since even before Trump came into office. That's very, very clear. I think when it comes to policing, it's really interesting here in Colorado because we actually have quite a bit of state legislation that protects immigrant folks. And one of those things sort of prevents police from collaborating with ICE in a variety of ways. So actually, when they came with all of these federal agencies last week, there was no police present at any of these raids, which is really interesting. But that's because of Colorado law. So there is a concern always, I think, of like what they are willing to do. And when I say they, I mean like Aurora police, right? Because they do have a history of racist, violent policing. And as we know, like the Department of Justice has suspended like federal oversight on these police departments who have like records, their own data shows of racist policing. So there is a sort of trepidation here, I think, in some ways, to just waiting to see what they may do,
One of the aspects that you've raised that I think is really important is the fact that so much of this narrative was started with the assistance, not just of a politician, but a slumlord company working there. And that feels like an important angle, the fact that we have, so many communities, working class communities, immigrant communities crowded into these slums. I mean, does it feel like in some ways those forces are similar to how a lot of employers a lot of times, will use ICE, are in a way want to increase the fear factor because they don't want their immigrant tenants to raise any issues about how they're operating?
Yeah, I mean, most certainly. You can't actually find, I don't think, a more perfect example of how, these slumlords who they're capitalists, right? They're very wealthy landowners who are running these slums, right? Charging thousands of dollars. They have a lot of immigrant folks who are in these apartment complexes, and they're not repairing anything. Like when you look at the buildings that this company who started a lot of this narrative back last summer, CBZ, these buildings were like, there were some units with no running water, and people were paying like $2,000 a month to live there. And folks get like trapped in these apartments, right? Because maybe they can't get approved anywhere else. And so they're raising concerns, and to the point where this slumlord, actually, the mayor of Aurora, who is not progressive, right, called this company a slumlord, right? And it's true. It's undisputed. They've been taken to court. And so they very opportunistically like latched on to this narrative about Venezuelan gangs taking over an apartment complex in order to pin the problems that they're causing on immigrants, right? On their tenants, who are actually the ones that are experiencing, all the violence from these landlords. So it's a really, really clear example of how these business owners, big business owners, team up with local politicians and the right, and it sort of takes off, and it causes real human costs, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Well, Katie, I have to say it's really been very interesting to see what's been taking place there in Denver, and we will continue to follow it on all the levels that we can. And we really appreciate you being willing to come on the show and enlighten folks to what's actually happening out there. Katie Leonard, organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, thanks so much for some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.